This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for January 8th through the 14th. This week we celebrate the lives of two music icons. Paul Simon makes history, a historic record label opens for business, and a new technological achievement is introduced. First off, let's talk about two icons who share January 8th as a birth date, although not the same year. In music, there's often someone who takes what is regarded as obscure or fringe music and brings it to the mass audience. This artist did that and became one of the 20th century's biggest icons by doing it. He was born on January 8th, 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi. When he was younger, he loved gospel and R&B music, having grown up in a majority African-American neighborhood. The family moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where he was bullied in school for being a mama's boy. His teachers thought his singing was, average at best, and for his 11th birthday, he was given a guitar. He couldn't put it down after that. This man is Elvis Presley. Elvis worked a couple of odd jobs after he got out of high school and tried to form a group of gospel singers that didn't quite pan out. But in 1953, he walked into Sun Records in order to record a couple of songs. Sun Records was focused on black artists at the time, and the record owner, Sam Phillips, wanted to bring the music to white audiences, and he was on the lookout for an artist who he thought could do that. Sam invited him to come back and record afterwards, and together they found a few guys to play with, and one night they were fooling around and played a blues song called That's All Right. They decided to record it and give it to a local DJ who played the song 3 days later. The radio station switchboard lit up, wondering who the singer was, and that was the beginning of Elvis Presley. He courted controversy for a few reasons. First, it was the 1950s, and the mainstream and America in general didn't appreciate music from the black community, especially early rock and roll. To have a white man singing it, especially one who grew up on it and had a genuine love for it, was pretty scandalous at the time. Second, the way he danced around and swiveled his hips was deemed way too liberal for the standards of the time. He fought censorship and racism. Didn't matter, though. The ladies loved him, especially the younger women. It is said that there were 4 phases to Elvis's career. The first was when he burst onto the scene full of youth and vigor, shaking his hips, outraging the parents, and stealing the hearts of their daughters. The second was when he was drafted into the Army, came out, and did movies. Really bad movies when you watch them now, but you look at them fondly as a product of a bygone era, I suppose. Phase 3 brought back the King's swagger for a few years at least. By 1968, Elvis was kind of washed up in many people's eyes. Sure, he was doing movies, but they were pretty campy and definitely about as far removed as you could get from what made Elvis Elvis, which was his swagger. Sorry, but Clam Bake does not have the same swagger as Hound Dog or Don't Be Cruel. Besides, during his movie phase, he had put on, let's just say, a few pounds. Plus, Bob Dylan and the Beatles had kind of stolen the swagger spotlight, and Elvis needed career help fast, or else he was just going to become an afterthought like a lot of other artists of the day. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, sold NBC television on an idea for a TV special, which was to be a variety special. The director of the show, Steve Binder, saw it a different way. He wanted Elvis to do a mini concert. It was to be a more intimate affair, with Elvis jamming in an intimate setting with the band, where they could joke around and play some songs with, of course, a lot of pretty women around him, because, he's Elvis. Elvis signed on to the concept, but first, the man had to get in shape. He took his wife Priscilla and a then very young Lisa Marie on an extended family vacation in Hawaii. When they came back, Elvis was tan and, more importantly, trim like his younger self. And on the night of June 27, 1968, dressed in his now legendary black leather outfit, they began to record the special. It still almost didn't happen, though. Elvis got a bad case of stage fright, and even though he was calmed down, you can actually see how nervous he was at first if you pull up the clips of the first few songs on YouTube. Of course, Elvis being Elvis, those performing instincts kicked in and the swagger came back. After the success of the special, Elvis started to do concerts again. Unfortunately, a few years later, he fell into the excesses of fame and turned into the caricature Vegas Elvis until his untimely death. Still, for one night in 1968, Elvis reminded people why he was, is, and always will be the king of rock and roll. In the late 1960s, Elvis was kind of sick of the way his career was going and was convinced to do concerts again, mainly thanks to the reception of that NBC TV comeback special. At this time, though, his young marriage to Priscilla Presley had started to deteriorate. He also started taking prescription drugs. He had been against drugs like pot, cocaine, and the like, but felt like a lot of people that if a doctor prescribed it for you, then it wasn't illegal and it was okay to take because the doctor told you to. The Presleys divorced in 1973. By then, his health was in a tailspin and he had begun the saddest part of his career, Phase 4. He twice overdosed on barbiturates in 1973. He kept touring during this whole time, found himself a new girlfriend, but really was never the same. According to members of his band, he would fall out of the limo, literally taking him to the performances, not being able to stand up. He would lean against the microphone, slurring the words to some of his songs, and he gained back that weight. An awful lot of it this time. In short, Elvis was in a pretty bad way. His record label became concerned, not so much for his health, mind you, but because he wasn't into recording albums anymore. His bodyguards started speaking out, but much like what happens when people speak out about such matters, they were let go. They both went on to write a book about Elvis's drug use that was released only 16 days before his passing, a book that Elvis actually tried to have stopped. The end for Elvis came in a very undignified way. While sitting on the toilet, he suddenly had massive pain, stood up for a second, then fell forward, face down. He tried to struggle, but to no avail. His new girlfriend found him, and although attempts were made to revive him, the drugs had taken their toll. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m. on August 16, 1977 in Memphis, Tennessee. While alive, Elvis Presley released 23 studio albums, 8 live albums, 29 EPs, 18 soundtrack albums, and 13 compilation albums. Of those, 20 hit number 1. He also released 152 singles, both while alive and posthumously. Of those, he's had 115 go to the top 40, with 27 hitting number 1 on various American charts. He sold over 500 million records worldwide. Let me repeat that. 500 million records worldwide. He held the record until very recently for most weeks at the top of the Billboard Top Albums chart at 67 weeks, along with many other accolades and awards. By the way, Taylor Swift now owns that record at 68 weeks and counting. These days, Elvis is accused of cultural appropriation, which cannot be ignored by any stretch of the imagination. However, for his part, he did love the music, and he did acknowledge the artists who his original music was taken from and built upon. Whether he actually gave them any monetary funds for this is a whole other issue, but it is hard to look at the past sometimes with a present-day lens and know what would have and should have been. Okay, except for the drugs. He really should have known that those were pretty bad. The king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, born January 8th, 1935. Next, this week is also important in the life of this next artist for many reasons. He was born on January 8, 1947. Growing up, he became hooked on rock and roll, specifically Elvis Presley, the man who he shares a birthday with. He also developed a fondness for theatrical performances, a characteristic that would help shape his career. He started out recording under his own name while he was still part of a group called Davy Jones with his King Bees in 1963 until January 14, 1966, when he released a single called Can't Stop Thinking About Me under his new last name, David Bowie. He took the name Bowie from the popular Bowie knife. He changed his last name so he wouldn't be confused with another artist who was gaining popularity on a TV show at the time. In June of 1969, David was on the outs with his record label. His first album was a complete flop, and he was looking for a new label. His manager negotiated a one-record deal with another record label, so into the studio he went. On June 22, 1969, he recorded a reworked version of a song he recorded earlier that year for a promotional film. The song was inspired by another film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. The song was released on July 11, 1969. The song's timing was intentional. At that time, the Apollo space missions were huge news. Apollo 11 had taken off on its history-making voyage to the moon. And the song wasn't released until after the mission, since it told the story of an astronaut who was lost during a space mission. That would kind of jinx the mission, they all felt. Once the song was released, it became a big hit in England, and Bowie finally found his foot in the door of the music industry. The astronaut who was lost on the song's mission, Major Tom, by the way, was found in the 1980s in a sequel of sorts to the song Major Tom Coming Home by Peter Schilling. Bowie's song, Space Oddity, is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as one of the 500 songs that helped to shape rock and roll. Although he finally had a hit on his hands in 1969, it wasn't until 1972 that he took glam rock by the throat and made it his own by creating a character called Ziggy Stardust. Then, once he was finished with that character, he created a new one called the Thin White Duke. In the 1970s, Bowie put out classic albums Scary Monsters, Aladdin Sane, Diamond Dogs, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, Young Americans, Heroes, and Station to Station, all the while being innovative with every new character he portrayed. David also became an actor, performing on Broadway in the play The Elephant Man and alongside a very young Jennifer Connelly and creatures from Jim Henson's workshop in the movie Labyrinth, which was a great movie, by the way. As the 1980s began, though, David wanted to take his career in a new direction. What he really wanted at that point in his career was mass popularity. He wanted hit singles. At least at that moment in time. Enter Nile Rodgers. Nile Rodgers was born in 1952 in New York City, and in 1970 he and Bernard Edwards formed the band Chic. The band's debut album in 1977 came out at the perfect time as disco was just beginning to hit its peak. The album had the disco hits Dance, Dance, Dance and Everybody Dance. 1978's Chic had the hit song that inspired the dance craze Le Freak, along with I Want Your Love. And in 1979, the album Risque had the classic song Good Times, whose bass line inspired artists like Duran Duran's John Taylor to play bass guitar, inspired songs like Queen's Another One Bites the Dust, and was ripped off / sampled extremely heavily for the groundbreaking hip-hop single Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang. Once Chic broke up in the early 1980s, Rogers went on to write songs for such artists as Sister Sledge, Daft Punk, and Diana Ross. He also helped to produce a lot of popular albums like INXS's Original Sin, Duran Duran's Notorious, and Madonna's Like a Virgin. According to Billy Idol, the story goes that in 1982, both he and Niles were at an after-hours club in New York City and saw Bowie sitting at a booth by himself. Both of them were afraid to go up to him because while both of them had hits on the charts for a few years by then and were pretty known worldwide, David Bowie was musical royalty even then and held icon status to musicians, especially in the early 1980s. Eventually, both of them did go over to say hi, and from that meeting, Bowie got the idea to work with Rogers on his next album, Let's Dance, instead of his usual producer, Tony Visconti. The album itself only took 17 days to record and mix, as David came into the sessions with a bunch of ideas already set. One of those ideas was the album's lead single and title track. David wrote the song as, in his own words, quote, a folk song. Nile took the song, rearranged it, and gave it a beat. Nile also played guitar on the song. That long guitar solo at the end of the song was done by the late great blues guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan, who Bowie had met in 1982 at a music festival. The song became Bowie's biggest selling single of his career and helped the Let's Dance album sell almost 11 million copies worldwide. The song hit number one in 14 different countries, including America, where it was also the 18th biggest single of 1983. The album was nominated for Album of the Year, where it lost to that guy with the one glove who did a dance called the Moonwalk and was kind of popular at the time. Might have heard of him. Name was Michael Jackson. Bowie would go on to make a couple more albums that were geared towards his new mass audience, but neither of them did as well as Let's Dance. He would go back to his innovative style with a band project called Tin Machine, along with working with Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails fame. On January 8, 2016, David Bowie released his final album, Black Star. People didn't realize it at the time, but the album was about his own death, as he had been privately dealing with liver cancer for 2 years prior to that and poured every ounce of energy he had left into his family and his work. On January 10, 2016, precisely 2 days after release of his final album, and coincidentally 2 days after his birthday, David Bowie passed away. David Bowie released 26 studio albums, 9 live albums, 2 soundtrack albums, 26 compilation albums, 8 extended plays, 128 singles, and 6 box sets. He also recorded over 400 songs. He had hits like Heroes, Fame, Let's Dance, China Girl, Modern Love, Blue Jean, The Man Who Sold the World, Young American, Space Oddity, Ashes to Ashes, I'm Afraid of Americans, Fashion, and the list goes on and on and on, and boy does it. David was nominated for 113 various worldwide awards, winning 43 of them, including 6 Grammy Awards and 4 MTV Video Music Awards. 5 of his albums made Rolling Stone magazine's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list, while 7 of his songs made Rolling Stone magazine's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time list. Trendsetter, innovator, the man who changed his name from Davy Jones so he wouldn't be confused with Davy Jones of the Monkees, Major Tom, Starman, the Thin White Duke. We pay homage and respect, much respect, to the man who's influenced music for 6 decades and to this very day, David Bowie. Born January 8th, 1947, and passed away on January 10th, 2016. Before we continue, we'd like to tell you about the Music History Today podcast, where we go over the events that happened on that particular day in music history. The Music History Today podcast drops every single day, including weekends, on this podcast network. Now, back to the Music History In-Depth podcast. January 10th is not just the date when David Bowie passed away. It is also the birthday of some other important people in the music industry. For instance, this woman was born on January 10th, 1953. Her career peak was in the 1980s, where she won 4 Grammy Awards, sold millions of records, 5 platinum albums, and is still touring to this day. She was one of the women at the forefront of the female hard rock movement of the 1980s. Her hits include Hell is for Children, Hit Me With Your Best Shot, and Love is a Battlefield. I've personally seen her twice in concert, and the woman never ceases to put on an amazing show. And she and her husband/guitarist, Neil Giraldo, were both inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame back in 2022. She is Pat Benatar. This next artist was born on January 10, 1948. He and his musical partner met at Bard's College, where they formed a band. They released a number of best-selling albums in the 1970s, which earned them a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He went solo for a time, which got him a hit song called IGY. He then returned to his band, and even though his partner Walter Becker passed away, the band still continues to tour to this day. The voice of Steely Dan, Mr. Donald Fagen, born January 10, 1948. This next artist was born on January 10, 1945. He was in a group called The Faces for a while with his fellow bandmate Ronnie Wood, who went and joined the Rolling Stones. He was also in the Jeff Beck group before he decided to have a go at a solo career. He's had massive success with his solo career, sliding from one genre to another. He sold hundreds of millions of records, and he is also in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once as a member of the Faces and once as a solo artist. He was recently knighted by the late Queen of England, Elizabeth II, back a few years ago. He is Sir Rod Stewart, born January 10, 1945. This next artist was born on January 10, 1943. Between 1966 and 1973, he released 5 albums. He was known as a great songwriter who had a lot of hits, including I Got a Name, Time in a Bottle, and Bad Bad Leroy Brown. His career was going great until he was tragically killed in a single-engine plane crash in 1973. He is Jim Croce, who was born on January 10, 1943. This next artist isn't really an artist, but he's extremely important to the music industry. He's a producer and a record executive who signed some of the biggest acts ever. The lists of artists he either signed or produced includes Aretha Franklin, Led Zeppelin, Ray Charles, Dusty Springfield, and Bob Dylan. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for his contributions to music. He is Jerry Wexler, born January 10th, 1917. There was one other event that happened on January 10th that needs a quick mention. On January 10, 2006, a soundtrack album came out that would become a cultural landmark for a whole generation of kids. 10 days after the soundtrack came out, the movie that it belonged to was shown on television. It launched more than a few careers and got people interested in musicals on television again long before the TV show Glee became a hit. We'll talk more about this in next week's episode, but for now, we will simply say happy birthday to the High School Musical soundtrack, which was released on January 10th, 2006. Back in the 1980s, the United Nations put sanctions in place against the country of South Africa. At issue was the racist policy of apartheid, in which the white minority retained all power, including deciding where people could go and who they could associate with, against a black majority. Think the Jim Crow era in the southern United States back in the early part of the last century. Transplant that to South Africa, supersize it, and you kind of get the idea. The sanctions were supposed to bring economic hardship to the country so that the government would be forced to give up its racist system of government. Companies were forbidden to do business with the country, but that didn't actually stop a lot of companies that you know and love from doing business through the use of middlemen or finding loopholes in the sanctions. For instance, one soda company found a loophole where instead of selling their soda outright, they sold a third party the syrup so that it could then be added with carbonated water in order to sell their soda to the country. Kind of clever when you think about it, I suppose. With the economic sanctions came cultural sanctions, which meant that musicians, artists, actors, etc. couldn't go and perform there. Of course, that didn't stop a lot of artists from performing there. There was a lavish resort called Sun City that was there, which would pay an awful lot of money to artists to make it worth their while to break the sanctions. There was even a protest album from a group called Artists Against Apartheid, led by Little Steven from Bruce Springsteen's band, called Sun City. This album had artists like Springsteen, Bono, Daryl Hall, and Pat Benatar, among many others, to protest the Sun City resort. Artists like Rod Stewart broke the sanctions. Queen also broke the sanctions, saying that they didn't want to disappoint their South African fans. Tina Turner broke the sanctions mainly because she was going through a divorce and desperately, and I do mean desperately, needed the money at the time. This was before her career was rejuvenated with the album Private Dancer, so a lot of people forgave her because of what she was going through. Another artist who broke the sanctions for completely different reasons was Paul Simon. He was searching for a new sound and had become taken with South African music. He went to South Africa to record with a group called Ladysmith Black Mambazo. When he came back to the United States, he was publicly criticized for breaking the cultural sanctions. What people didn't realize was that instead of going there to make a quick buck, he was actually laying the groundwork for what became the album Graceland. That album would go on to become his best-selling album of his career and also his most decorated, winning Album of the Year for that year's Grammy Awards. It would also spark interest in South African music, helping to bring groups like Ladysmith Black Mambazo, along with Johnny Clegg and Savuka, into the United States and European mainstream. The sanctions did end up having their desired effect. In the early 1990s, political prisoner Nelson Mandela was released, apartheid was disbanded, Mandela was elected president of the country, and the sanctions were finally lifted. To celebrate, on January 11th, 1992, the country threw a concert. Paul Simon was the first international artist to legally play in South Africa without fear of criticism or reprisals. What is ironic about this concert is this. The concert was meant to celebrate the end of a racist regime and the beginning of what was hoped would be more equality between the races. However, white people still had most of the money in the country and most of the jobs. Tickets for the concert went for $30 US. You would think that that's a great price for a concert, especially back in 1992, and you would be right if, again, you were a white South African. However, to the vast majority of black South Africans, $30 was a hell of a lot of money, so they couldn't actually afford to go to the concert that was there to celebrate their freedom. Therefore, the concert to celebrate the end of a racist regime was attended mainly by the very same people who had benefited from that very same regime in the first place. The irony. Paul Simon, becoming the first international artist to legally play in South Africa on January 11th, 1992. A man in Detroit, Michigan started a record company that was at the forefront of R&B music for over 30 years. In the late 1950s, Berry Gordy was a songwriter. He wrote songs for artists such as the Matadors and Jackie Wilson. He's credited with having written Jackie's big hit, Lonely Teardrops. Like a lot of songwriters, though, he felt like he wasn't getting the money he deserved to be making, and he was probably right at the time. Berry decided that it was time for him to start his own record company. Around that time, his sister had started a record company called Anna Records and wanted Berry to join her. Berry said no, but he did want to do his own thing. He borrowed some money, took his royalties that he made off of Lonely Teardrops, and started a record company himself. And on January 12th, 1959, that record company opened for business. It was called Tamla because Tammy Records was already taken. At first, his records were being released nationally under Anna Records, including his first hit record, Barrett Strong's Money, That's All I Want. He signed the act who he used to write songs for, the Matadors. They changed their name to The Miracles. The lead singer of the group, Smokey Robinson, was given a role in the company's leadership along with other members of the family, including Anna. As the years went on, the record company grew to the point that by 1966, they had 450 employees and made over $20 million annually, which, seeing as how it was the mid-60s, was an awful lot of money. They also perfected their now legendary assembly line way of doing business. They did everything from writing songs for their acts to teaching their acts how to behave and perform. Their roster reads like a who's who of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame at this point. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, The Temptations, The Four Tops, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, the Jackson 5, and the list keeps going. For decades, they were the wealthiest black-owned company in America. Now they're a part of Capitol Records, at least at last check. And even though their heyday seems long since past, their mark on American culture will never be forgotten. The beginning of Tamla Records, which soon thereafter would get a name change to Motown Records, opened for business on January 12th, 1959. In the early part of the 20th century, the 78 RPM record was the preferred choice for making records. Made from a shellac compound, the records had a couple major problems with them. First off, they were heavy, like really, really heavy. Have you ever held one? They're extremely heavy. Second, they broke if you dropped them, and that happened an awful lot. In 1948, Columbia Records came out with an alternative, the 33 1/3 RPM, or LP if you prefer, vinyl to the hipsters out there. It was cheaper to make than the 78 and was an awful lot lighter. It definitely did not shatter the way that 78s did, and that actually marked the beginning of the end of the 78 record. The other nail in that 78 coffin occurred on January 10th, 1949. RCA had been working on making vinyl records for years before Columbia released their invention. They finally released their invention on January 10th, 1949. This was an alternative to getting a large album. It was smaller and specifically made for 2 songs, one on each side. They were color-coded for specific genres. Bet you didn't know that. The black ones were for pop music, classical was on the red ones, musicals were on the blue ones, country was on the green ones, kids' music was on the yellow, and R&B was on the orange. Why orange? Couldn't tell you. It did, however, allow artists to release one song at a time. Plus, with it being much cheaper than a long-playing record, kids could afford them much easier. In the beginning, though, it had problems, as both classical music and standards were all the rage. In fact, RCA had to cave in and start making long-playing records of their own in order to compete with Columbia, who at that point had a stranglehold on the LP market. The 45's full potential would not be seen for almost a decade after, when a new music force burst onto the scene. What we talked about half an hour or so ago, rock and roll. The single would be a force in music for almost 30 years until cassette singles, CD singles, and then, of course, music downloads took over completely. The invention of the 45 RPM record, more popularly known as the single, unveiled on January 10th, 1949. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for January 8th through the 14th. Thanks for listening.